So we were lucky enough to win the die roll here. And we were not lucky enough to get a keepable hand. So let's hope for a better 6 here. This 6 isn't great. We're missing a 1 mana play, but I think we still pretty much have to keep it. The problem with a hand like this is that this Dwinnen's Elite can potentially just come down as a Grizzly Bear, and that's not at all what we want to be doing. So our opponent's starting on a Mountain and a Blister Coil Weird. Okay. Interesting. Very interesting. So we drew the delayed Llanowar Elf. So we can play that here. And we're not getting out of the gates too quickly, so we'll see what this Blister Coil Weird is going to do. I have a feeling our opponent's got a lot of cantrip-y type stuff in their deck. But you don't see this card being played too often in Modern, that's for sure. So now we actually have a choice. We could just trade our Llanowar Elf for the Weird. And it actually seems reasonable to go ahead and trade it. Though it's definitely a close decision. Yeah, let's go ahead and see what our opponent's got here. Could be that our opponent has a 0 mana spell. Okay, so it is Mutagenic Growth. So that's going to save the Weird and get rid of our Elf. But that's okay. We're trading an Elf for 4 points of damage, essentially. And now we drew a second Elf. So here I like playing our Elf and playing the Dwinnen's Elite. And it does look like our opponent is on only 1 land here. But this deck is going to be playing a bunch of different instants and sorceries. So here's a Swift Spear. And so it looks like our opponent is once again representing another Mutagenic Growth. So the question is, how do we want to block here? And to be honest, there's not really a great block that we can line up. So I think we just want to put a token in front of the Blister Coil Weird. And that was kind of playing around Mutagenic Growth. Maybe our opponent didn't have it. Who knows? If they didn't, it was definitely a good attack. But here we drew Elvish Archdruid, so we're going to play it for sure. And get in there with our guys. Now our creatures are beefed up, and we can start putting some pressure on our opponent. Now, our opponent could have, if they had had a Mutagenic Growth, played it on the Weird to untap it. So definitely something to think about. But we're not going to put our Archdruid in harm's way. Our opponent is on 1 land here. And here's a Brute Force, so gonna be taking a reasonable hit here this turn, but with that being said, hopefully we'll have a good turn of our own coming up here. So this is going to be a total of 7 damage, it looks like. Unless our opponent has something in addition to this. So if our opponent did have another Mutagenic Growth, that would be 4 more damage, essentially. But it would also mean our opponent would have to take 2 in order to cast it. Alright, so there is actually the second Mutagenic Growth, so that's going to resolve. And we're going to take a huge hit. So pretty impressive hit that our opponent just dealt us. And so now we kind of have to think about how we're going to survive and make it through this game. We do have a Shaman of the Pack. So we can play that and bring our opponent down to 7, actually. So it may be that we want to attack first. Yeah, I kind of like attacking first. That way, if our opponent doesn't block, we can actually just kill them, because they would be at 4 after this attack. But our opponent could also block and then have another trick too. But it looks like no blocks, so we should be winning this game with this Shaman here. So yeah, we were pretty lucky there that our opponent didn't draw another land, for sure. So looking at the sideboard, we want Abrupt Decay and Dismember for removal for these Swift Spears, these Blister Coil Weirds, these cheap creatures, and our opponent seems to be piling in a bunch of direct damage, or pump effects at the very least. The Finks also seems reasonable. The Essence Warden also seems reasonable. So cards we don't necessarily need. The Lead the Stampedes just seem very slow, especially on the draw. So I'm fine with just completely cutting them. And then besides that, we would need one more cut. We can also board in the Scavenging Ooze as well. And so I think we can just shave a Nettle Sentinel here and one Heritage Druid. I'm fine with cutting one of each in this sort of situation, because we're not going to need that much mana when we don't have our Lead the Stampedes in our deck anymore. So we're just kind of hoping to not die to the early assault and play a fair game with this type of deck. And going back to the block we made with our Llanowar Elves in game 1, it was definitely happy we made that block, because we're just trying to protect our life total here. So going to go ahead and start off the way we want to. It looks like our opponent actually does not have one of the signature 1-drops, but that could also mean that our opponent has a 2-drop, which can be even more powerful. And we see it here, Young Pyromancer, immediately being played, and then, wow. So Gut Shot is going to take care of our Llanowar Elves, and that's going to set us way back. So that was a great turn for our opponent. Not what we wanted to happen, for sure. So yeah. I mean, now our opponent can kind of do whatever they want. Here's a Kiln Fiend. And yep, makes sense to attack for 1 here with the Elemental. Okay, our draw step here is Heritage Druid, so that could enable us to be able to do some things. So I think we want to go ahead and start off on a Elvish Visionary here, and then we can follow it up with the Heritage Druid. And making 3 mana is going to allow us to then cast another Visionary and probably this other Heritage Druid that's in our hand. Sorry, not the other Heritage Druid, this Elvish Mystic, my fault. So yeah, we're going to play the Mystic for sure. And that's going to be our turn. So we're just going to go ahead and pass back here. And we'll see what our opponent is going to do. So this would be an extremely aggressive attack, but it also could very easily mean that our opponent has a pump spell in hand. And this Kiln Fiend is just so hard to deal with. It's so threatening. So we're in a very precarious situation here. We don't want our elves to die, but at the same time we may not be able to help it. So our opponent's got 5 cards in hand. Pretty interesting spot here, but just gonna go ahead and chump the Kiln Fiend. It may seem unconventional, but this is the card that can deal us the most damage. And so yeah, here we see a Desperate Ritual. So we'll see if what else our opponent has. Hopefully we can play a few more turns of the game, but okay, Titan Strength, that's pretty good. So this is threatening a bunch of damage here. It looks like a total of 6 damage potentially this turn. Unless our opponent has another spell, which they very well could. This ritual is pretty annoying. But at least we're blocking the Kiln Fiend as of right now with our Visionary, or else it would just be way too much damage. But if our opponent can give this Young Pyromancer Double Strike or something, that would be pretty good. It looks like a couple of Titan Strengths. So the Young Pyromancer is huge, and we're taking a total of 12 damage for the turn. And of course our Visionary hit the dust. So yeah, that was not a great situation to be in. And so our draw here is a copy of Pendelhaven. So we've got to tread carefully, absolutely. But let's start by casting a Collected Company. And we're going to leave our Nykthos untapped, our Black Source untapped, because we may really need those mana sources. So we got a Dwinen's Elite, and then also an Azuri that we're going to want to take here. And so we're positioning ourselves to have a bunch of blockers for this next turn here. We have the Collected Company, which we can basically use at will now. So we can also make some mana with Nykthos, and we have this Heritage Druid at our disposal as well. So a lot of things we can do here. I think we want to cast the Heritage Druid, and let's go ahead and make some mana here. And this is going to be setting up for another Collected Company. So we can make 3 and then activate Nykthos. And so that's actually going to give us access to a total of 9 mana here. So we're going to start with Collected Company. And it's going to give us an Archdruid and a Nettle Sentinel. And then we can go ahead and play the Shaman, our last card in hand. And the Shaman is going to deal a nice chunk to our opponent. We could have actually killed our opponent if we had hit another Shaman off of the Coco, but we did not. So we're just going to deal a huge amount of damage to our opponent and then pass the turn. And we're just basically hoping not to die in this situation. So we're going to block everything that we can and hope that it is good enough. So, yep. Hopefully these blocks These blocks can save us, and we can live to fight another day. But, okay, so it is going to be a Temur Battle Rage on the Kiln Fiend. And so it looks like that is going to do it. And notably, even if we had blocked differently, this would have been enough damage, it looks like. I guess we could have double blocked the Kiln Fiend, but to be honest, I'm not familiar with the deck enough to be able to do that. But if we had actually double blocked this Kiln Fiend, we maybe would have had a shot there. Would have to do the math again, but in any case, we did lose that game. So, pretty unfortunate. But going on to game 3 here. And we saw Titan Strike. So, Temur Battle Rage was definitely a reasonable card to consider. Possibly should have considered a little bit more, but that's the good thing about playing a deck like the deck our opponent's playing. It's hard to know exactly what's going on from our side of the table. So, props to our opponent, and we are going to be on the play here. So, hopefully that's going to give us an edge, and pretty happy with this configuration, I think. So, we don't need to really do too much. We've got the cards we want to in our deck, and interesting hand, but it has multiple Abrupt Decays. So, even though we don't have a lot of creatures, we've got in general what we want here. We've got a Heritage Druid, and the Abrupt Decays can take out whatever threats our opponent happens to have. So, looks like a Swift Spear is going to start things off. And we're, of course, just going to take the 1 here. And, okay, so we could play this Visionary, but I think we want to hold up Abrupt Decay instead. So, let's just go ahead and attack with the Heritage Druid and pass back. And we'll see exactly what our opponent can do in this spot. So yeah, thinking about back to game 2, I actually think if we double block, we would lose to a Titan Strength. But if our opponent had already played 3 Titan Strengths that game, so we probably was an error. But this deck just seems really cool. And so I don't think we're going to fire off the Abrupt Decay unless our opponent does something first. And so here's a Mutagenic Growth. Actually, multiple Mutagenic Growth. So this is going to be a really juicy time to use our Abrupt Decay, because our opponent's basically moving in on the Swift Spear, which makes sense because the Elf deck doesn't play that much removal. But the fact is that we basically have it in this situation. So we've got exactly what we want. And this almost is going to be game over for this type of deck, because if our opponent just goes all in and we kill the Swift Spear here, which happens, it's pretty hard to rebuild. It's not impossible, but it's going to be pretty hard for our opponent to rebuild in this spot, I think. But I'm not saying it's incorrect to go for it, because we're only playing 2 Abrupt Decays and 1 Dismember, which is actually more removal than most lists play. So our opponent going for it, it looks like they're on a 1-land hand, so it may have just been, you know what, if you have it, you have it. Sometimes with this type of deck, it's just kind of an all-in strategy. But here we've got we just drew an Elvish Archdruid. We've got removal, so we've got a lot of tools in hand, and the question just becomes at this point how to best utilize these tools. And Collected Company is definitely one direction we can go in. So we can start with the collecting company, or we can wait on it. And so it's a pretty close decision between waiting to cast Coco and doing it right now. But I think we want to just do it right now. And wow, so we actually hit double Shaman, so that's great. Whenever you hit double Shaman, it's almost just game over on the spot. So we hit double Shaman. That's gonna bring our opponent down to 4. And now we can actually play our Elvish Archdruid and force our opponent to block one of our creatures. So this is pretty much game over. If our opponent ends up somehow, doing something, I will be very, I'll be shocked if our opponent finds some way out of this. But theoretically, I mean, if our opponent has something like a Pyroclasm in hand, that would actually wipe our board. So there's always cards you have to think about. When playing a deck, you don't know what's going on, but that is going to be the match, and alright.